Hello friends, welcome to lesson 7, Colonial Construction of Gender, Introduction. Most of the subjects studied today across the world have been widely influenced and developed in line of Western thought. This is due to the widespread colonization that took place a few centuries ago. The population of the colonized nations were taught the Western or European understanding of the world and human relations as the elite modern version, and thus there is a lingering effect of Western culture and thought on these parts of the world. However, after decolonization movement of the 20th century, people grew conscious of such influence and tried to liberate themselves from Western thinking and adapt the subjects according to the perspectives and beliefs of their own land and culture. Objectives of this lesson. After completion of this lesson, you will be able to understand the concept of coloniality. You will be able to analyze the extension of coloniality to gender as a concept. First, let us begin by discussing about concept of coloniality. The coloniality of power is an expression coined by Anibal Quijano, Peruvian sociologist and humanist thinker, to name the structures of power, control and hegemony that have emerged during modernist era, the era of colonialism which stretches from the conquest of the America to the present. Such structures such as gender are shaped by diversified processes and indicators changing over time and across locations in relation to dominant model. Coloniality established the European model of patriarchy as the dominant gender order against which all others are judged, giving rise to coloniality of gender concept. Anibal Quijano thinks the intersection of race and gender in large structural terms. So, to understand that intersection in his terms, it is necessary to understand his model of global Euro-centered capitalist power. Both race and gender find their meaning in this model, that is pattern. Quijano understands that all power is structured in relations of domination, exploitation and conflict as social actors fight over control of the four basic areas of human existence, that is sex, labor, collective authority and subjectivity or intersubjectivity, their resources and products. What is characteristic of global Euro-centered capitalist power is that it is organized around two axes that Quijano terms the coloniality of power and modernity. The axes order the disputes over control of each area of existence in such a way that the meaning and forms of domination in each area are thoroughly infused by coloniality of power and modernity. So, for Quijano, the disputes, struggles over control of sexual access, its resources and products define the domain of sex or gender, and the disputes in turn can be understood as organized around the axis of coloniality and modernity. This is too narrow an understanding of the oppressive modern or colonial constructions of the scope of gender. Quijano's lenses also assume patriarchal and heterosexual understandings of the disputes over control of sex, its resources and products. Quijano accepts the global Euro-centered capitalist understanding of what gender is about. These features of the framework serve to reveal the ways in which non-white colonized women were subjected and disempowered. The heterosexual and patriarchal character of the arrangements can themselves be appreciated as oppressive by unveiling the presuppositions of the framework. Coloniality is the theory that colonialism was not a closed historical event but is an ongoing process of social and political domination. Social structures such as gender are shaped by this process, changing over time and across locations in relation to the dominant model. Coloniality established the European model of patriarchy as the dominant gender order against which all others are judged, giving rise to coloniality of gender concept. Let us now discuss about coloniality of gender. The coloniality of gender builds upon the coloniality of power as developed by leading theorists like Annibale Quijano and Walter Mignolo, the professor of literature, one of the founders of the modernity coloniality school of thought. The coloniality of power is understood to act to dismantle other knowledges and ways of life. It is the persistent, categorical and discriminatory discourse that is reflected in the social and economic structures of modern post-colonial societies. Maria Lugones, Argentine feminist philosopher, activist and professor of comparative literature, is a leading decolonial theorist and member of the decoloniality group. She adjusts Quijano's formulation of coloniality of power through a deeper consideration of gender and its entwined relationship with race. She argues that Quijano's understanding of sex or gender as defined by patriarchal and heterosexual contestations over sexual access is paradoxically Euro-centered understanding of gender. She therefore sees Quijano's framework as a further means through which the subjection and disempowerment of colonized women can be covered. Maria Lugones explains that the coloniality of gender refers to gender and sex binaries as colonial constructs that together with race, ethnicity and class are the key hierarchical identities that colonial rulers used to dehumanize, divide and perpetually subjugate colonized people. Coloniality of gender accounts for differences in the subordination and the violence inflicted on men, women and gender non-conforming persons of color. There are several ideas and examples in Lugones' heterosexualism and the colonial model gender system that further explain why and how the colonial gender system places the colonized on the dark side of dehumanization and genderlessness. Lugones uses two main frameworks in her analysis. One, gathered from various third world women of color feminists, and the other from sociologist Annibale Quijano's idea of coloniality of power. Quijano's coloniality of power tells us that colonizers created the category of race through the domination of colonized with European and Indian and African as racial identities that became a part of every aspect of social existence as it spread across the globe. Lugones expanded and improved on Quijano's idea to include gender, biological dimorphism, heterosexual patriarchy are all characteristic of what I call, this is what Lugones says, I call the light side of the colonial model organization of gender. Hegemonically, these are written large over the meaning of gender. Quizano seems not to be aware of his accepting this hegemonic meaning of gender. Hegemony in general perception is domination. Lugones describes what she calls a colonial modern gender system in which European colonizers are categorized into dimorphic gendered light side and a non-human and therefore non-gendered dark side. In other words, women of color are categorized as genderless and dehumanized by Western society as a result of imposition of colonization, while white women are in a category of gender that is understood as everything that white men are not. It is in this way that the colonial or modern gender system serves as an explanation for the specific gender violence and sexism experienced by women of color. To understand this concept further, let us first take a look at the light side. Lugones lists biological dimorphism, heterosexualism and patriarchy as the characteristic of the light side. But what does she mean by white women being seen as everything white men are not? Sociologist and gender scholar Oironke Oiwumi has a great article that further explains the notion of the gendered categorization of white bourgeoisie women as a negation of white men and why white women were given the category of gender in the first place. Nuclear family structures are another social construction left over from colonialism. In Eurocentric capitalist society, the nuclear family is headed by the man with his wife and children as his subordinates, and there is a dichotomy that exists between the woman and the man in a nuclear family. The man is physically strong, resourceful, dominant, the property owner who operates in the public sphere, and therefore the woman or mother or wife is not instead. She is fragile, delicate, submissive, the property owned operating in the private sphere of the home. The identities of upper class women were constructed based on their relationship to or the presence or absence of men. For example, even today we still put the prefix Miss, MISS or MS and Mrs in front of women's names while men only have Mr. Traditionally, taking the man's last name in marriage is meant to show the man's ownership over the woman. Again, this is a Euro-centered cultural phenomenon that has been imposed. The dichotomy of the man and mother or wife is the staple of the nuclear family institution, and mothers or wives serve as reproductive machines to enforce the continuation of this institution and white supremacy. In other words, European upper class women were gendered because of their ability to have children which would assist to continue the rule of white supremacy. They fit within the framework of the upper class Euro-centered nuclear family because of this function, and it is one of the reasons why we have such a heavily enforced gender binary system still today. So much so that transgender and non-binary people face abhorrent levels of violence and discrimination, while intersex people are forced to be corrected into the binary with unethical surgeries. Philosopher Kimberly Crenshaw, American civil rights advocate and a leading scholar of critical race theory, gifted us with the theory of intersectionality way back in 1989. The queer feminist scholar Moya Bailey coined the term misogynoir to describe how both gender and race play roles in bias directed towards black women. But how does the coloniality of gender help explain this difference? Colonizers eroded and systematically destroyed the structures of women-centered communities and societies and left white supremacy and patriarchy in its wake. Colonized people were regarded as being closer to animals than men and women and were closer to nature than to humanity. This is what is meant by the genderless dark side. Operating under the coloniality of power, colonizers were free to access the bodies of colonized women and they were seen as unrapeable since they were not seen as human. Decolonial thought calls for peace to be based on irrevocable mutual recognition of humanity between persons and peoples as well as the promotion of diversities or ecologies of knowledges. Lugons explains how coloniality permeates all aspects of social existence and gives rise to new social and geocultural identities, thereby creating gender identities as well as racial identities. From a coloniality of gender perspective, colonization altered the indigenous sense of self and identity as well as understanding of cosmology and of gender relations. In doing so, the modernity or coloniality implemented European understandings of gender and sex, erasing the various conceptualization of sex and gender that pre-existed the European modern or colonial gender systems. The concept of gender was introduced by Western colonizers and became a tool for domination that designates two binary oppositions and hierarchical social categories. Women became defined by their subordinate relation to men in all categories. Colonization thereby created the concepts of race and gender. The imposition of race accompanied the inferiorization of the indigenous and imposition of gender accompanied the inferiorization of indigenous women. Lugons explains that Western colonial discourses positioned women of color as animals outside of civilized womanhood. This made it possible for Western colonizers to kill women and children of color indiscriminately, defying their own gendered humanitarian prescriptions. Women of color feminists such as Amina Mama, Oironke Oivumi, Matsushita Motsei and Maria Lugons have explained that Western colonizers' privileging of patriarchal interpretations of Christianity and indigenous cultures created unequal heteronormative gender relations in some colonized societies while deepening pre-existing heteronormative gender inequities in others. Colonial distortions of culture and religion variously created, intensified and provided new or further justification for different forms of gender-based violence and negative discrimination. Raven Connell, Australian sociologist, explains that the pre-colonial conceptions of gender are complex and structured differently from European conceptions. However, gendered violence played a formative role in shaping of colonial societies and subsequently flourished post-colonization through the coloniality of gender. In her own words, Colon says that colonization itself was a gendered act carried out by imperial workforces, overwhelmingly men drawn from masculinized occupations such as soldiering and long distance trade. The rape of women of colonized societies was a normal part of the conquest. The colonial state was built as a power structure operated by men based on continuing force. Brutality was built in colonial societies according to Connell. Oironke Oivumi, a leading post-decolonial feminist scholar and gender theorist, finds from her research of Yoruba people West African ethnic group of the contemporary Nigerian, Benin and Togo states that gender was not an organizing principle in Yoruba society prior to colonization. There simply was no gender system in place in Yoruba society and culture. The subsequent oppressive gender system that was imposed on Yoruba society through colonialism encompasses the subordination of females in every aspect of life. Oivumi explains that the concept of gender was introduced by the West as a tool for domination that designates two binary oppositions and hierarchical social categories. Women were defined in their relation to men and were unable to have power, own land or participate in leadership roles in society. The implementation of the concept of gender in Yoruba society resulted in the emergence of women as an identifiable category subordinate to men in all situations. Audra Simpson, political anthropologist, provides insight into how lingering heteronormative discourses of settler colonialism inform political structures in contemporary Canada. This exposes how the indigenous female body comes under scrutiny in gendered settler colonial political structures. Simpson highlights that the erasure of native women within the settler colonial geopolitical structures by discussing the hunger strike of Chief Teresa Spence of Attawapiskat First Nation in Canada. Chief Teresa Spence hunger strike in December and January 2012-13 was met with public disbelief and skepticism. Simpson cites blog posts, editorial commentary, mainstream media and popular discourses in response to Spence's hunger strike, revealing how Spence's political claims were ignored but her body came under attack. Simpson identifies the sexist and racist response to the female native body to question the heteropatriarchal normative of settler colonial Canada. From the brutality of colonization to the gendered and racial identities of native and indigenous women in contemporary post-colonial societies, Maria Lugones leads the call for decolonial feminism. She argues for a review of modernity, coloniality from a consciousness of race, gender and sexuality. Decolonial feminism, like post-colonial feminism, forms part of the third wave of feminism and provides a structure for understanding and constructing identity for non-Western women, particularly indigenous and other women of color. Decolonial feminism deconstructs Western gender concepts that have become normalized and seeks to recover indigenous worldviews of gender and incorporate them into feminist discourse. Feminists working within this frame are a community of mainly native and indigenous women scholars constructing a new feminist geopolitics of knowledge. As the world became increasingly interconnected, this binary of heterosexual and Western patriarchal notion of gender became the foundation of modern societies. The modern societies organize family, economy, politics and interpersonal relationships, making it appear to be a natural form of social organization and thus marginalizing other genders and sexualities. communities which previously held complementary gender relationships or non-patriarchal family structures became assimilated, eliminated or discriminated. Coloniality also created the concept of race, redefining the ethnicity of indigenous and black people as biologically inherited and positioned hierarchically below that of white Europeans. Race became a proxy for colonial domination and an axis of oppression that sustains the system of coloniality. Race and gender intersect within this process. This defines the sexualized stereotypes of colonized women and accepting tendency to violence as an attribute of Latino and black men. Lugons also provided us with ways to decode some of the implementations of colonialism on different categories of people. When it comes to gender, Lugons asserted that it was not just a social construct but a colonial imposition. She called this idea the coloniality of gender. There are many systems of oppression that construct our reality in the Western world. They shape our experiences and dictate the way we interact, categorize and understand our fellow beings. White supremacy, capitalism and sexism are some of these systems of oppression, all of which are encompassed by colonialism. The coloniality of gender provides a framework for us to unpack our constructed realities and think critically about the origins of social problems and the legacy of colonialism. Within a better understanding of the results and full history of racism and sexism embedded in our culture, the more work we can do to unlearn it and the more we can move towards constructing improved societies, new epistemologies, that is, new knowledge systems and realities will be existing. Feminist epistemologies have long identified the contrast in which the identities of white women and women of color are constructed. It is crucial to reposition and reframe our knowledge to pre-colonial societies. Before colonization, many indigenous societies operated with women at the center of communities. Sexualities outside of what we have come to understand as heterosexual not only existed but were often widely accepted and honored, but with colonization, heterosexualism, Euro-centered capitalism, the coloniality of power categorization system dismantled every aspect of these societies. It was not until later on through the centuries that colonized women of color were shaped into othered women, women who were highly eroticized with insatiable sexualities and therefore still always sexually accessible to white men. This is why stereotypes like the Jezebel served as further justification for colonizers to continue to use sexual violence as a means of domination of the colonized. Culturally, domestic workers, sex workers and proletarian working class women of color societies undesirables are not viewed as pure, delicate and feminine in the same way as wealthy white women are, because working class women lack the delicate, fragile, gendered female traits of the upper class. White women, they did not fit into the counterparts within the Eurocentric upper class nuclear family. The main takeaways from Lugon's coloniality of gender are the importance of understanding its main purposes to help maintain domination over sex, authority, labor, intersubjectivity, how people psychologically relate to each other as well as their resources and products. As a society, fully understanding our history in regard to gender, sexuality and race and the impact of colonization is the first step in healing the harm of the past and building a just future for every human being. Women of color feminists have made clear what is revealed in terms of violent domination and exploitation. Understanding these features of the organization of gender in the modern or colonial gender system, the biological dimorphism, the patriarchal and heterosexual organizations of relations is crucial in an understanding of the differential gender arrangements along racial lines. It is part of their history that only white bourgeoisie women have consistently counted as women so described in the West. Females excluded from that description were not just their subordinates, they were also understood to be animals in a sense that went further than the identification of white women with nature, infants and small animals. They were understood as animals in the deep sense of without gender, sexually marked as female, but without the characteristics of femininity. Women racialized as inferior were turned from animals into various modified versions of women as it fit the processes of Eurocentered global capitalism. Thus, heterosexual rape of Indian women, African slave women coexisted with concubinage as well as with the imposition of heterosexual understanding of gender relations among the colonized when and as it suited Eurocentered global capitalism and heterosexual domination of white women. Colonized females got the inferior status of gendering as women without any of the privileges accompanying the status for white bourgeoisie women. Through the history presented by Oivumi and Allen should make clear to white bourgeoisie women that their status is much inferior to that of Native American women and Yoruba women before colonization. Oivumi and Allen also make clear that the egalitarian understanding of the relation between males, females and third gender people has not left the imagination nor the practices of Native Americans and Yoruba, but these are matters of resistance to domination. Erasing any history including oral history of the relation of white to non-white women, white feminism wrote white women large, even though historically and contemporarily white bourgeoisie women knew perfectly well how to orient themselves in an organization of life that pitted them for very different treatment than non-white or working class women. White feminist struggle became one against the positions, roles, stereotypes, traits, desires imposed on white bourgeoisie women's subordination. No one else's gender oppression was approved. They understood women as inhabiting white bodies but did not bring that racial qualification to the articulation or clear awareness. That is, they did not understand themselves in intersectional terms at the intersection of race, gender and other forceful marks of subjection or domination. Because they did not perceive these deep differences, they did not see a need for creating collisions. They presumed a sisterhood and a bond given with the subjection of gender. When we try to understand the Indian scenario, then with specific reference to India, gender oppression and gender roles have been part of Indian societal tradition. Women were considered to be subservient to their male counterparts, either by religious dictation or cultural custom. The females in society were expected to be served as child bearers in order to propagate the family lineage of her male counterpart. With the introduction of both British colonial rule, gender inequality was perpetuated. The British Raj not only allowed the caste system to stand, but used it as a legal basis for Indian subjugation, thus subjugating Indian women on a larger scale than was previously dictated. While gender roles, inequality and oppression were present, colonial rule not only continued these practices but perpetuated them. Friends, let us now summarize this lesson. Coloniality is the theory that colonialism was not a closed historical event but is an ongoing process of social and political domination. Social structures such as gender are shaped by this process, changing over time and across the locations in relation to the dominant model. Coloniality established the European model of patriarchy as the dominant gender order against which all others are judged, giving rise to coloniality of gender concept. Coloniality of gender accounts for differences in the subordination and the violence inflicted on men, women and gender non-conforming persons of color. Thank you.